The only thing from my childhood that I remember about Christmas that comes anywhere close to being a tradition was
kill anybody.
Part 2. Being better give me those pizza rolls soon or they'll be hell of a pain.
Interwar Austria was marked by an identity crisis between maintaining its independence, which it had attained through the disillusionment of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of World War I, and forming a possible political union with Germany. This conflict arose internally from pan-Germanists and Social Democrats who desired an Austrian-German union, the Social Democrats wanting the union to be a democratic republic, and Catholic conservatives who had supported the Habsburg dynasty and came to prefer Austrian independence over joining Germany, as they saw it as a Protestant-dominated state. This clash plagued the short-lived and unrecognized Republic of German Austria, which comprised the areas with a predominantly German-speaking and ethnic German population. This republic lasted almost a year before it was dismantled by the news that the Treaty of Versailles and Saint-Germain would forbid an Austrian-German union. Outside pressures that arose to greatly exacerbate these existing tensions and eventually haunt the newly formed First Austrian Republic came from Fascist Italy's interest in it remaining a buffer state between them and Germany, which provided pressures from the south, and the ever-increasing push to become a part of Germany mounting from the rise of the Third Reich meant an ever-increasing pressure of annexation from the north. The gravity of fascism was seemingly inescapable as both countries wanted to use Austria for different reasons, and before the conclusion of this brief suspension between the Phoenixes saw Austria's annexation by the Third Reich, an interesting form of parafascism arose. So let's briefly set the stage for the rise of Engelbert Dollfuss, the paraphoenix of Austrofascism. To begin, Dollfuss was born on October 4, 1892, in Lower Austria during the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was the illegitimate child of two peasants, Josepha Dollfuss and Joseph Winninger. Joseph was an orphan apprenticed to a miller and with little prospects for the future, as he belonged to a lower social class than Josepha. So Josepha's father forbid his daughter to marry Joseph. Instead, he had her arranged to marry Leopold Schmutt, a peasant from a neighboring village with the same social class as her. Dollfuss would go on to do very well in school and as an altar boy at a local church. Well enough, in fact, that the village priest arranged a scholarship for him at the Archiepiscopal School in Holleban. The expectation was for Dollfuss to eventually become a priest himself. Peasant life in Lower Austria had developed deep traditions for faith-driven, familial, and community cooperation due to unfavorable conditions set by liberal ministries that briefly dominated the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the mid-19th century. The Austrian peasantry as a whole from this developed hundreds of cooperatives, 400 of which were in Lower Austria, out of the necessity for survival against economic poverty. And by the late 19th century, the tradition of Christian corporatism was well planted with an antagonism to liberal capitalist policies that had forced them into hard times. This environment, in turn, engendered a drive within Dollfuss early on to support this cultural makeup and view it as of prime importance to social and political life. After high school, Dollfuss would attend the University of Vienna to pursue a career as a priest. However, as James William Miller explains, he would not become one. Dollfuss completed his secondary education and entered the University of Vienna's Theological Seminary in 1913 when, after an intense period of soul-searching, he decided that he did not have the makings of a priest. He was particularly concerned that he would not be able to keep an oath of celibacy. He still wanted to serve the peasantry, just not as a parish priest. So he turned instead to the study of law with the intention of pursuing a career in public service. Fast forward to World War I, when he was recruited but denied service at first due to his short stature. He was 4'11". However, this wouldn't stop Dollfuss from going to the recruiting commission for his district and insisting that he serve on the same day he was initially denied. Even if he didn't meet the aforementioned height requirement, he was finally recruited as a volunteer, serving in the Tyrolese militia at the Italian front just south of Tyrol for 37 months. By 1916, he had moved up in the ranks to lieutenant. After the war, Dollfuss would resume his legal studies and worked with Karl Rudolph's social welfare movement in 1918. During this time, Dollfuss would expand his own political philosophy through his exposure with the ideas of Othmar Spann and a foundational text within the Catholic social teaching, The Rights and Duties of Capital and Labor, or as it's more traditionally known in Latin, Rerum Novarum. Both were influential in fleshing out the many particulars of Dollfuss's own variation on corporatism. He went on to work at a peasant union to gain more experience and proved to be effective in helping them recover from the war, and to keep them away from Marxist influence. He went on to further his studies in Berlin, disliking many of his professors for their socialist and liberal leanings, as he stood firm in his conviction to put Christian principles into economics as he saw it. Based on his experiences in Berlin, Dollfuss began work on a treatise that he intended to become his dissertation in political science. The manuscript is of interest because it provides insights into Dollfuss's ideological makeup. He was convinced that unfettered capitalism would be the ruin of the Austrian peasantry and that cooperatives could provide a way for the peasants to compete successfully. Furthermore, the cooperatives were a way to infuse the marketplace with Christian values. Not competition was the guiding principle of cooperation, but mutual support. The corporative movement valued the needs of the community over the desire of the individual for private profit, and so embodied the principle of brotherly love that was so central to Christian ethics. This clearly Christian social anti-capitalist view of political economy was accompanied by another lesson that Dollfuss thought could be learned from the example of the cooperatives. When people joined a cooperative, they became responsible, not to one another as individuals, but to the cooperative as a whole. Though they were free to leave the cooperative at any time, they were bound to the leadership of the cooperative in a dependent relationship while they were members. Dollfuss understood the cooperative to be an ideal model of democracy in action, but his understanding of democracy was an elitist rather than a populist one. He had little sympathy for the grassroots democracy so typical of the populist forms of agrarian cooperation in the United States in their early stages. While the members of a cooperative might freely elect their leadership, they were obligated to obey them once the leaders were in place. In a cooperative, members are not obligated to one another as individuals, but to the cooperative as a whole in the form of its leadership. He returned to Vienna to work in Lower Austria's agricultural institutions, where he would help to advance and develop them, even going on to represent Austria at the International Agrarian Congress. He would then become Austria's Federal Minister of Agriculture and Forestry in 1931, and then Minister of Foreign Affairs in 1932. From his history, it's clear that his politics were founded on a Catholic and corporatist conservatism that would come to see the Austrian Liberal Republic as a mistake. The two leading political parties of the First Austrian Republic were the Catholic Social Party, the Conservatives, which Dollfuss was a member of due to its close ties with the Austrian peasantry and Catholic institutions, and the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Austria, the Social Democrats, which with their affiliated paramilitaries, that being the Heimwehr Home Guard on the conservative side, and the Schutzbund, the Republican Defense League, on the Social Democratic side, would violently clash multiple times during the Republic's short life. One of the Home Guard leaders would even go on to attempt a march on Vienna, which we will explore a little later on. Some of the other political parties were the Landbund, a German nationalist agrarian party, the Greater German People's Party, a German nationalist liberal party, and the German Nationalist Socialist Workers' Party, the Austrian Nazi Party. With the 1930 legislative election, the Social Democrats had emerged as the largest faction in the National Council, with 72 out of the 165 total seats, but the Conservatives, with 66 seats, formed a new coalition government. The two previous chancellors before Dollfuss, Ender and Burisch, following this election, were ineffective at dealing with a number of political issues, causing severe instability. During Ender's time, a notable problem was the Kronaanstalt, a major Austrian bank, going bankrupt. This was just one in a series of financial crises that would lead into the Great Depression. Ender's attempts to resolve this issue weren't enough to prevent his forced resignation. Burisch didn't have it much easier, when only later in the same year of the bankruptcy, one of the Home Guard leaders attempted a coup, both events happening within 6 months of each other. The bankruptcy in May and the attempted coup in September of 1931. Let's roll it back a little and explain more about the Home Guard. The Austrian Home Guard is regarded as starting out politically broad, but acquiring a proto-fascist character later on, as Griffin writes. In the first decade of their existence, the Heimwehr lacked the organizational or ideological cohesion to constitute a fascist force, its only core principles being virulent patriotism and anti-Marxism. What reversed its gradual decline into a negligible paramilitary movement was the uprising of Viennese workers in 1927, supported by the Social Democrats' paramilitary arm, the Schutzbund. The energetic role played by the Voluntary National Guard in helping the government restore law and order not only established them as a key factor in state politics, but ushered in a phase of eternal upheaval from which it would emerge a more united and radical movement. A development which won it the material support of both Mussolini and the Hungarian Prime Minister, Bethlen, as a possible bridge between their two countries. The openly proto-fascist orientation of its politics was formalized when in May 1930 its leaders took the Korneiberg Oath, committing the movement, albeit in nebulous terms, to replacing parliamentary democracy by a Catholic, German, and corporatist state. The specific usage of proto-fascism here means a form of palingenetic ultranationalism, which lacks the tactical or populist radicalism to be considered a fully fledged form of fascism. To summarize, forms of palingenetic ultranationalism that, in theory, express a desire for a new ultranational order, but refrain from making any serious attempts to create or initiate a movement of mass mobilization to disrupt the existing order in order to create that new world. The most problematic taxonomically are those which, while using the rhetoric of the reborn nation and rejecting liberalism in theory, are too elitist or utopian to set about creating a cadre-led mass movement which is dedicated to using a combination of legality with violence to seize state power. They thus hold back from any serious attempt to break with both parliamentary democracy and traditional restorationist conservatism, and so create a genuinely new order which will eventually mold all the people, considered ethnically sound, into a national community under the leadership of a new elite or political class. Such movements in practice are insufficiently radical in their populism to destroy traditional ruling elites, and in their ultranationalism to destroy the existing political system, and hence never place themselves in a position to translate their visionary words into revolutionary deeds. By contrast, genuine fascism is sufficiently radical in its aspirations, extremist in its tactics, and action-oriented in its mentality, at least to attempt to create a cadre-led mass revolutionary force capable of seizing power. Nevertheless, the shared core of palingenetic ultranationalism points to a kinship which can be recognized by terming the former proto-fascist. This term does not imply that the movement in question necessarily precedes the appearance of a genuine form of fascism, even if this is often the case. However, one Home Guard leader, Walter Freimer, was radical enough to act on his revolutionary ambitions and tried to orchestrate a coup in 1931. He headed the Home Guard divisions in the Styria region, but his march on Vienna failed as the rest of the Home Guard did not follow him. So his attempted coup would be struck down by Austrian military and police forces within half a day, and he would be given the appropriate nickname of half-day dictator. Even if Weimar's coup was thwarted, Thurisk would lose important German nationalist allies the following year due to the continuing problems facing Austria, causing a minority cabinet, blah blah, he did some austerity measures, parliament stuff is complicated. He was succeeded by Dollfuss on May 20th, 1932. Listen, Bing is just trying to get to the main 4'11" star of this show here. Fun fact, if you stretch a picture of Dollfuss, he becomes Chonky Dollfuss. The rest of the Home Guard that did not participate in Weimar's attempted coup would go on to play a part in Dollfuss's government. Engelbert Dollfuss assumed the position of Chancellor during the final years of the First Austrian Republic. On May 20th, 1932, he had become the head of the coalition government formed by the Christian Social Party, which included the Landbund and the Home Guard. The self-elimination of the Austrian parliament happened about 1 year later, on March 4th, 1933. The Austrian constitution at this time had no mechanism for how the National Council, Austria's lower house of parliament, should operate if its 3 presidents all resigned. And in almost comedic fashion, this is what happened. To summarize a convoluted moment in history, railway workers learned that their salaries were going to be paid in 3 installments, and they conducted a strike on March 1, 1933. This led to a heated debate within the National Council 3 days later. The Conservatives, which had the majority at this time, wanted to implement disciplinary measures. The Greater Germans People Party and the Social Democrats were opposed to the disciplinary measures. Just to emphasize how complicated this whole situation is, Being's going to play a clip from the Time Ghost video.
On March 4th, 1933, the National Council, the lower house of parliament, is debating how to solve an ongoing railway workers' strike. The final vote is expected to be extremely close, so much so that political decisions are taken to win the vote that will result in the parliament literally eliminating itself. Now, let me explain, okay? The constitutional makeup of the First Republic is pretty complicated, but basically, the National Council has a president as well as a second and third president, who together are responsible for running political affairs and administrative proceedings. The presidents are elected and belong to political parties just like every other National Council member, but they are not allowed to vote, right? Okay. Following uproar about a previous ballot, Karl Renner resigns from his position as first president so that he can give his Social Democrat Party an extra vote. Second President Rudolf Ramek takes up his post, but he too then resigns so he can cast his vote for the Christian Social Party. Third President Sepp Strafner is now in charge of things, but as you probably have already guessed, he too resigns so that he can vote for his Greater German People's Party. The National Council now finds itself, having a bit of a problem. You see, there has to be a sitting president for a vote to take place, but they've all resigned so they can vote. So Parliament has effectively become paralyzed, and Dollfuss, hardly sympathetic to democratic tradition in the first place, seizes his chance.
The thing the Constitution had no mechanism to account for happens. What now? Well, it's dictator time. During this whole episode, Dollfuss's anti-liberalism came to fruition, as he used this weakness of Parliament to rectify the mistaken failure of liberal democracy as he saw it. On March 7th, the National Council was still without presidents, and Dollfuss declared that the federal government could act through the Wartime Economic Authority Law, which meant he could rule by emergency decree. Austria's president at this time, Wilhelm Miklas, made no attempt to stop this. Instead, he became an unopposed part of Dollfuss's regime while privately condemning it. Dollfuss's dictatorship would be dubbed Austro-fascist by many academics and historians, but was otherwise a type of authoritarian conservatism that was heavily fascistized, but remained at its core an attempt to preserve conservative values and institutions, such as Catholicism, and maintain Austrian independence against the revolutionary dynamics of Nazi Germany that threatened it. The influence that Mussolini had on Dollfuss as a source of fascistization manifested most bluntly in the Fatherland Front, also known as the Patriotic Front, which was founded on May 20th, 1933 as a merger of the Christian Social Party, Landbund, Home Guard, and other favorable groups. Adopting similar aesthetics and paramilitary organizations to those of genuine fascist regimes, but instituted and crafted by an established elite, used to merge favorable groups under him to salvage Catholic Austria from a Protestant-dominated Germany, instead of this movement coming from a genuine popular base that would drive a new order. Following this, the Austrian Nazi Party was banned on June 13th, 1933, and soon after, Schutzbund was banned on the 30th of that same year and month. Both forces went underground to continue their fight against the Dollfuss regime. Griffin's commentary on the Home Guard after the March on Vienna and the eventual creation of the Fatherland Front is thus: the pathetic outcome underlines the continued imperviousness of Austrian liberalism to fascism, despite the growing political and economic crisis. That the bulk of the Heimwehr stopped short of full-blown fascism was clear, not just from the way that Weimar's units had to go at it alone, but from its reaction to Dollfuss's decision of September 1933 to solve the protracted crisis of the liberal state by replacing it from above with a Christian corporative one. Instead of rejecting out of hand the new regime as a counterfeit of the new order, he had pledged to create. The national leader, Sturzenberg, agreed to become vice-chancellor and to head the Patriotic Front, a pseudo-populist umbrella organization for a wide range of conservative, Christian, and nationalist groups. Much of the movement's rank and file tamely followed suit. Basically, even when the Austrian Republic was in a deep crisis, it still managed to throw off a fascist attempt at power. But, as we're exploring, Austrian liberalism wasn't completely immune to authoritarian destruction, as Dollfuss's Othkon regime was able to take it out. On February 11, 1934, Vienna Home Guard commander Emil Fay called for the disarmament of the Schutzbund. Soon after, the Hotel Schiff in Linz, a property owned by the Social Democrats, is raided. Schutzbund commander Richard Berneschek was one of the first to actively resist. This immediately escalates the already high tension between these forces and promptly results in an armed conflict. The Austrian Civil War began on February 12, 1934. The war was between two sides: the Fatherland Front, which was backed by the Federal Army, police, Home Guard, and other favorable groups, against the Social Democrats, the Republican Protection League, and the Communist Party. The fighting lasted until February 16th of that year. It was about a 4-day war, with the Fatherland Front winning in the end. This gave Dollfuss the justification to ban the opposition parties, effectively ending the multi-party system in Austria and furthering his own consolidation of power. On March 17, 1934, the Roman Protocols were signed between Dollfuss, Mussolini, and Hungarian Prime Minister Gyula Gambos, which will be explored when we get into the Horthy section later on. The protocols established cooperation and further advancement of economic relations between the countries. They were also part of a larger cooperation regarding defense against Germany and opposition to Yugoslavian territorial integrity. Even if Dollfuss promised Mussolini that he would transform his regime into a fascist one, his May 1st, 1934 constitution didn't paint the final nail in the First Austrian Republic's coffin brown in any genuine sense. What stood over the corpse was something else. The new federal state of Austria, or Ständenstaat, corporate state, was a corporative state that was so influenced by Catholicism that Stanley G. Payne would describe it as virtually theocratic, but Dollfuss's reliance on the pre-existing bureaucratic institutions left many Catholics unimpressed, as Martin Conway explains in his book on Catholic politics during this time. Catholic attitudes were more circumspect, certainly, among both the laity and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. There was considerable support for Dollfuss's action against the atheist Social Democrats. But the bishops were nervous about the ambitions of the regime to circumscribe the independence of Catholic action and of Catholic youth movements. While many lay Catholics were left unimpressed by the efforts of Dollfuss to pose as the savior of Catholic Austria, for all its Catholic rhetoric, the regime relied essentially on the institutional power of the bureaucracy, army, and police, and Dollfuss's attempt in 1933 to launch a new official party, the Fatherland Front, aroused little popular enthusiasm. This constitution was kept in line with Dollfuss's established conservative and corporatist ambitions, pushing state-enforced Catholicism, but not allowing the state to become outright theocratic. As a result, the Catholic authority in Austria was placed under Dollfuss, as he presumed himself to be its protector. Along with this came a type of fascistized corporatism that was greatly influenced by the Catholic social teaching. This was carried out by abolishing elections for the National Council and having its members be nominated and organized directly by the state's leaders in the 4 corporatist-style councils: the State Council, the Federal Culture Council, the Federal Economic Council, and the States Council, which provided advice and information from Austria's respective regions. This meant that all the members were under the immediate control of Dollfuss's authority, without any electoral interference. The state took complete control over employer and employee relations. This was viewed ideologically by the regime as the best way to foster the benefits of corporatism's use of class collaboration, so as to have the leader's decision be in step with easing class tensions. However, From an anti-authoritarian point of view, this can be seen as silencing any dissent from the workers and keeping tighter controls on them and society at large to try and prevent notions of class struggle from causing any more problems for the regime. Neither point of view is contradictory in the sense that both corporatists and anti-corporatists would agree that antagonistic class relations produce instability for those in charge of them. It should be mentioned that the Catholic social doctrine was long established as a form of corporatism before Mussolini's regime, so Dollfuss could easily view the political program as familiar and not strictly belonging to fascism. He did still fascistize, as noted, a source of which was his relationship with Mussolini and its role as a strategic advantage for some time, holding out over the ever-threatening encroachment of Nazi expansion. If you remember from earlier, Germany was already viewed as a Protestant state by Austrian Catholics, so the dire situation wasn't just a threat to preserving territorial lines, but also more personally a threat to Dollfuss's spiritual identity. Thus, the regime made sure to crack down on anyone pushing pro-Nazi or more generally pro-German unification ideas. It's not the first para-fascist regime to assume power, but it's the first among the ones we're examining to have their leader die. Dollfuss was assassinated on July 25, 1934, by disguised Austrian Nazi and German SS forces during what became known as the July Putsch. They had managed to get inside the chancellery and kill Dollfuss. But the rest of the government inside was able to escape, and the plotters were soon struck down by government forces after receiving no help from Germany. It turns out that Dollfuss's family was being entertained by Mussolini's wife in Italy during this, and Mussolini himself was enraged to discover the news of what was going on in Austria. In response, he moved his troops to the Austrian border and told Hitler not to invade. Hitler responded by denying his involvement in the coup attempt. This effectively left the plotters to their own devices. The successor to Dollfuss was Kurt Schuschnigg, who maintained the ban on Nazi activities for obvious reasons. The Home Guard would see its eventual neutralization under Schuschnigg when all military associations from October of 1935 to July of 1937 were disbanded and merged into the Front Militia, which had become an official part of the armed forces. The scene was thus set for the final stage in the neutralization of the Heimwehr when, in April 1936, Dollfuss's successor, Schuschnigg, removed Sturrenberg from both his offices, disbanded his movement, and absorbed his members into the Front Militia, the new paramilitary arm of the Patriotic Front. Parafascism had successfully absorbed proto-fascism. Before moving ahead into the later part of Schuschnigg's regime, let's quickly go over what's been going on with Italy. Specifically, their invasion of Ethiopia from October 3, 1935 to May 5, 1936, which had put them in hot water. This got Italy expelled from the League of Nations and harmed its already tense relations with France and the UK. Initially, the reason Mussolini supported Austria was that he saw Hitler as a threat and used Austria as a buffer state against German expansion south, as we previously mentioned. However, Germany's rearmament of the Rhineland put international pressures on it, so the two regimes ended up in common company and soon became natural allies. Italy couldn't pick the USA or USSR as an ally because of ideological reasons and internal policies of the other two, and Japan wasn't seen as a full ally at this time due to its distance. So with this and their mutual support for the Spanish Civil War, Mussolini no longer stood in Hitler's way of capturing Austria. Hoping to improve his relations with Germany and even get some territory for himself in Greece by getting Germany to stop supporting the Greek dictator at the time, Metaxas, whom we will be covering in the third part along with two other regimes. Schuschnigg spent much of his role attempting to try and reach an appeasement with Adolf Hitler, even remarking in one of his own books, Austrian Requiem, on the dire situation. As I stood at the grave of my predecessor, Chancellor Dollfuss, the situation was very clear to me. I knew that in order to save Austrian independence, I had to embark on a course of appeasement. This meant that everything had to be avoided which could give Germany a pretext for intervention, and that everything had to be done to secure in some way Hitler's toleration of the status quo. It also meant finding a modus vivendi with the Nazis in Austria and with those in Germany, To attempt this by an agreement with the Austrian Nazi underground was absolutely pointless. No matter how honorable the intentions of the Austrian Nazi leaders might have been, no matter how great their sincerity, one word from the German headquarters and all agreements were null and void. On February 12, 1938, Schuschnigg went to Hitler's Bavarian vacation home to meet with him to try and smooth over relations. However, due to the increased severity of the situation Schuschnigg was in, remarking in hindsight that this interview was the beginning of the last act for Austria, he soon called for a referendum on Austrian independence after the meeting. In hopes of a yes majority, he dismantled the single-party state by lifting the ban on the Social Democrats and their affiliate trade unions. So for a brief window of time, the federal state of Austria was technically a multi-party state, but by March 11, 1938, Hitler forced his resignation. This effectively stopped Schuschnigg's referendum, and the Anschluss would commence the next day on March 12, 1938. It should be noted that when Germany occupied Austria, it held its own referendum. The ballot design was manipulated in such an obvious way to suggest that those voting that they should put yes. Schuschnigg was arrested soon after by Nazi authorities and wouldn't be freed until May 1945, just months before the end of World War II. Interestingly, Schuschnigg would go on to live and teach in the United States for 20 years, 1947 to 1967, after which he would return to Austria to spend the rest of his life. Dollfuss's reputation in the post-war period is often framed in a positive and heroic light. Conservative Catholics turned him into a religious martyr who bravely fought against the evils of Nazism to try and defend the Catholic faith. While it's true that Dollfuss did resist and fight the Nazis, it wasn't to free Austria from authoritarian rule, but rather to maintain his own against an opposing form of it. To make him or any other Authcon into a good guy would be a horrible mistake of judgment, unless you happen to prefer that form of authoritarianism yourself. Dollfuss has even been framed as someone who tried to save Jews from Hitler's forces, which is a simplistic framing. Sure, he did try to prevent Nazis from killing Jews, but he himself was anti-Semitic. An example of this in his history is his involvement in preventing any member tainted with Jewish blood from entering a Catholic Students' Congress in 1920. Even if he didn't issue any official state action as chancellor and even issued a statement against racial anti-Semitism, the government does not stand on the race viewpoint. It is not anti-Semitic. He still conducted a number of covert policies against Jewish people. You might also notice some post-war fascists that would also idolize his rule. This seems to be one of the many leftover effects of these fascistized regimes where they are still seen as ideological kin by some modern-day fascists. Although it is not impossible to use one of these leaders as a source of inspiration for establishing a genuinely fascist movement. As will be covered in the third part on parafascism, one of the regimes discussed there has had a post-war fascist movement in its country use its parafascist leader as a source of inspiration. Negative post-war conceptions of Dollfuss came early on when historians and academics tried to reframe his regime as Austro-fascist. These relied on flawed conceptual groundings, a few of which were criticized in the Picking at Sticks videos, but to generalize here, they often viewed any nationalist dictatorship as belonging to the fascist phenomena, especially those, as we understand now, were actually parafascist instead. This misidentification of the federal state of Austria as exhibiting a form of Austrian fascism misses the very conservative history that Dollfuss belonged to, and how much he maintained those convictions in his dictatorship. Rather than pioneering a uniquely Austrian fascism, one could argue instead that he developed an anti-liberal conservatism for Austria in order to safeguard its traditions. Recent examples of misidentifying Dollfuss, although cute and more informal, include the 2011 cartoon, Heldenkanzler. In it, Dollfuss is given a checklist by Mussolini on what a true fascist needs and goes about checking things off that list. Interwar Hungary, as with Austria, is another country born out of the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the political instability that followed. At the brink of the dual monarchy's death, as the Great War was coming to a close and the Central Powers were defeated, protests erupted in the streets of Budapest. The Aster Rose Revolution was beginning. From October 28th to October 31st, 1918, the liberal and social democratic forces of Hungary, led by Mikolai Korolai, took over, using the opportunity of a weakened establishment to take control of the government and pronounce Hungarian independence. The final nail that would officially send the Austro-Hungarian Empire into the graveyard of history, creating the Hungarian People's Republic, which was also called Hungary's First Republic. In March of 1919, a split in the socialist forces would oust the First Republic and create the Socialist Federative Republic of Councils in Hungary, better known as the Hungarian Soviet Republic. In May of that same year, a counter-revolutionary government formed by conservative forces was led by Gyula Karolyi, the cousin of Mikolai Korolai. Talk about awkward family reunions. The Reds began to institute a Red Terror, arresting and executing counter-revolutionaries. So you have a counter-revolutionary government, a Leninist government, and on top of that, Romania invaded to claim territory. The conservative forces were determined to salvage the traditional infrastructure of Hungary's recent past and its elite from the weak liberal republic that had been ousted by the socialist menace that was causing further instability and destruction to these institutions. Horthy then was the perfect choice for conservative forces to call upon to defend their way of life and fight back against their revolutionary enemies. Given his history of military command in the Austro-Hungarian Navy during World War I, even attaining the rank of vice admiral in 1918, and his lifelong allegiance to the nobility, which he was born into, monarchy and national conservatism as a whole. So it's no surprise as to why Horthy was put in command of the military force to crush the communists and drive out the Romanians. His forces began instituting a white terror, arresting and executing any communists and also doing pogroms against Jews. Horthy himself didn't order the mass killings, but he refused to condemn them either and defended the officers who carried them out. In an interview, he was asked if there would be a white terror in Budapest. He responded, "No, but some people will have to swim." He also met with representatives of the Jewish community in Budapest to get their side of the story, but didn't really do much. The Romanians were ordered by the Entente to withdraw, and the communists were crushed. The White Terror was winding down. Another major source of frustration for the Hungarian right was the Treaty of Trianon, which saw Hungary lose much of its territory. This created an irredentist drive to different degrees and motives depending on what your politics were, but more specifically what this meant to Admiral Miklos Horthy and the conservative elites that would put him in power. The idea that liberal democracy was a mistake that had led to political instability in the face of radical forces like socialism and fascism was shared amongst many other Afghans in other countries, as we will come to see. On March 1st, 1920, the National Assembly re-established the Hungarian kingdom. However, since the Allies wouldn't accept the king's return, they put Horthy in charge as regent through a vote. Interestingly, when they went to ask Horthy to take charge, he declined unless the powers of the office were expanded, which made his eventual acceptance of the regency position more powerful from the start. It wouldn't take long, however, for the king to try and retake the throne twice, as he did the very next year. The first attempt by King Charles IV of Hungary, also known as King Charles I of Austria, to retain the throne was in March 1921. This wasn't a complete shock, as Horthy and him frequently communicated in the interwar era, and Horthy considered himself still a loyal subject to the king. Parliament by this point was dominated by two monarchist factions, the Legitimists, who wanted Charles IV, and the Free Electors, who wanted to elect a new king. Horthy had also gotten a taste for power by this point. When the king showed up at the palace, Horthy was only informed minutes earlier. Horthy took the king into his office and had a very difficult conversation that lasted a few hours. Horthy even remarked that it was the most difficult moments in my entire life. Horthy had told the king that it was too dangerous for him to take power, and Hungary needed Horthy at this time. However, the king disagreed with this, and by the end of it, Horthy said he picked the nation over the Habsburg dynasty. The king then departed the palace. Of course, this didn't completely deter the king from trying again. The second attempt was in October of that same year, when the king and a bunch of MPs and soldiers marched on Budapest to forcefully take back the throne, with Horthy begging them not to do it and to just wait for the right moment. By the end of it all, Horthy had said the king was led astray and he would defend Budapest. An army and militia were raised, and Charles gave up and left Hungary, never to return. After the first initial attempt by the king to return to his throne, Horthy asked Bethlen, a Hungarian aristocrat and conservative ally, to form a strong government that would make sure that the new state would be able to eliminate any more possible threats to the country. And so Bethlen formed the Unity Party in 1922, renamed the National Unity Party in 1932, and unsurprisingly won in a landslide in the election following that year. Nothing better establishes the nature of Horthy's regime than what Stanley G. Payne says here. Moderate conservative authoritarianism was thus represented by the Horthy regime itself, a counter-revolutionary system that aimed to restore and preserve as much as possible of the old 19th century social hierarchy. The regime governed by a restrictive parliament of limited suffrage headed by monarchy, or in this case a regent, Horthy, as surrogate. The regime's National Unity Party may be seen as a fairly typical government party for an authoritarian or semi-authoritarian South European system of the time, though the limited degree of representation permitted by the regime gave this more of an electoral and parliamentary cast than in more overt dictatorships. This semi-plurality was most overtly represented in the role that the United Party played in elections and how those elections were manipulated in a way to maintain its prominence within the parliamentary system so that Horthy could maintain close control over it, preventing any attempts by fascists, liberals, or socialists to elect themselves into state power. One of the expanded powers that Horthy was given as regent was the ability to dissolve parliament at any time. So even if a form of party plurality existed, it was heavily dominated by the regent, who, despite being elected, could only be removed by the king's return. Hence the unique position that Horthy finds himself in, that Payne describes as a moderate form rather than the more overt forms of Authcon systems that banned and or absorbed other political parties or outright removed political parties entirely. This trend of moderate authoritarianism continued into the 1920s, until the Great Depression hit. The wave of instability that followed made many unfavorable to the old-fashioned conservative prime ministers, and would end up with a further right one in 1932 that would lead to the country's subsequent fascistization, but very much still on conservative terms. Let's take a detour to establish some of the other forces moving around Hungary at this time. As Griffin notes, a number of patriotic societies sprang up, cultivating a myth of the nation's decline and imminent rebirth, many of which are considered fascist but also proto-fascist. As we previously mentioned, the role of proto-fascism in Dollfuss's part. Some of these Hungarian proto-fascist movements, according to Griffin, are Masco's Hungarian Hitlerite movement, formed in 1932 sporting green shirts and the arrow cross symbol, or Count Fascisti's Hungarian National Socialist Party, offered little more than crude Hungarized versions of the Nazi-Aryan myth, with no scheme for seizing power and thus remained a proto-fascist. Gambos's Party of Racial Defense, established as a far-right breakaway from the Unity Party in 1923. He created the party because he saw Horthy's regime as too conservative, and even talked of a march on Budapest. However, Griffin considers them proto-fascist because, as he remarks when including them with the other similar groups, they didn't seriously set out to create for themselves a mass space or erect a radically new order on ultranationalist lines. As the government stabilized throughout the 20s, Gambos would temporarily become more moderate. His Party of Racial Defense would see his merger back into the Unity Party by 1928, and he himself would become Minister of Defense in 1929. This proto-fascist force was thus absorbed back into Horthy's conservative government. In contrast to these impotent forces, Bosmorani's Scythe Cross, formed in 1931, for a time mobilized a peasant following with vague slogans of land reform and social justice, laced with attacks on liberals, Bolsheviks, the Habsburgs, cosmopolitanism, and of course the Jews, all presented as standing in the way of the regeneration of the Hungarian race. As usual, such palingenetic wishful thinking fell at the first hurdle when put to the test. Despite attracting 20,000 members and forming a paramilitary arm, the Scythe Cross's bid to stage a peasant revolt against decadent Budapest in 1936 was a fiasco. Of course, the other fully fledged fascist force was the Arrow Cross, led by Széleszy's Hungarianism, is set against a quite different ideological landscape. The small ultranationalist groups that sprang up in the 20s had developed their own equivalent of Volscic Arianism centered on the myth that the Hungarians were a pure Turanian race descended from a judicious blend of Persians, Hittites, Egyptians, and Sumerians, Jesus himself being a Turanian. Now the Habsburg yoke had been removed, Hungary could regain its historic greatness, but only if the threat posed to it by Bolshevism and Judaism and the destabilizing force of parliamentarianism could be eradicated by a new political elite. Turanianism established itself as a common denominator of all fascist groups from then on. Szallasi blended it with Christian notions of moral regeneration based on a social national, that is, corporatist, reconstruction of the economy, which would put an end to class struggle and exploitation and a geopolitical vision of a radically restructured new European order, reflecting the natural hegemony of certain nations. Freely using millenaristic imagery, his writings explained how the Hungarians were destined, possibly in an alliance with the legionary Romania, an extraordinary idea given the profound ethnic tensions between Hungarians and Romanians, to establish the Carpathian Danube greater homeland, on a par with the European empires of the two other leading races, the Germans and Italians. Under the tutelage of these three chosen peoples, Europe would be healed of the ravages of secular liberalism and materialistic socialism, and a new age of peace would emerge. Like Quisling, Szallasi saw the Jews as only constituting a cultural threat to the newborn nation. They were to be physically removed from Europe, not to extermination camps, but to an unspecific homeland of their own, though a benign form of anti-Semitism, one which deterred Szallasi even less than Quisling from cooperating with the SS in the final solution. A speech he made 10 days after the Russians took Budapest demonstrates how deeply he was imbued with a Paleogenetic myth that could turn total defeat into victory. Without Good Friday, there is no resurrection. We shall drink the bitter cup to the last drop, so that the new world can arise, which gives human life a new meaning. Now that we've established some of the other forces running around Hungary at the time, let's return to our main subject. His regime's most infamous prime minister, Gyula Gombos, who served from October 1st, 1932 to October 6th, 1936, had his own bid to align the country with the Axis. It was a particularly noted source of fascistization, although Gombos's politics were more focused on narrow ethnic racism and lacked certain degrees of radical action, like forming an anti-systemic populist movement to oust Hungary's traditional elite. Instead, he remained a proto-fascist. He criticized Horthy and even flirted with removing him, but he never put this into action. So his invitation to power meant he could form fascistized institutions, but remained under the authority of Horthy. Horthy allowed this controllable fascistization to happen largely because he saw Nazi Germany as a more manageable evil that could be used to help him fight off the worst evil of Soviet communism, as he saw it at the time, and possibly also retain the lands Hungary had lost. Germany, as well as Italy, would also help Hungary economically survive the Great Depression throughout the 30s, which made them reliant on the Axis. However, no matter how much Horthy hated communism, he would soon learn the hard way that fascist cooperation was an uneven double-edged sword, with 2 inches poking away but 6 inches cutting back deep. Gombos had plans to make the fascistization far more extensive, hoping to remodel the Hungarian government into a single-party state similar to Nazi Germany. These plans, however, were left unfinished as he died from testicular cancer on October 6, 1936. Rest in poo-poo-pee-pee. To try and summarize the various short premierships under Horthy that followed Gombos, they usually fall into 2 groups. Those that advanced the Hungarian system in a more authoritarian direction, with many of them attempting to appear more neutral to Allied countries, but ultimately siding more with the Axis, and being forced to resign due to their ties and sympathies with them and Hungarian far-right groups. The other group was comprised of a much smaller group of men who were more moderate and politically loyal to Horthy, one of whom we will explore after going into Hungary's involvement in World War II, starting with the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. As Germany took it over and partitioned it, Hungary was given land with a significant Hungarian population in what was known as the First Vienna Award of 1938. During the Second Vienna Award, Hungary was given more territory in Romania. Hungary, feeling beholden to the Axis for economic and territorial support, joined them on November 20, 1940, and was soon given more land in the Yugoslavian invasion. This streak of success would soon come to a bitter end, as history would turn against Hungary during Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Hungarian troops fought all over the Eastern Front. For his part, Horthy was happy to help defeat communism. Most notably, his army was part of the rear guard at Stalingrad, before being pummeled by the Red Army. As mentioned, Horthy accepted the German alliance as Hitler had promised Horthy all the land he claimed. However, ideological tensions began to mount, as Horthy refused to hand over Hungarian Jews to be deported to concentration camps. As we established earlier, Horthy was an anti-Semite, just not in favor of outright extermination. This happened during the premiership of Miklos Kalai from 1942 to 1944. Kalai was one of those more moderate men who we spoke about earlier, as he assisted Horthy in slowing down the cooperation of Jewish genocide and economic affairs, and he assisted in establishing contact with the Allied forces to discuss switching sides. Then, in the summer of 1944, the USSR launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive in the north and center of the front, and then ramped up their offensives in the south. When part of Romania was occupied by Soviet troops, there was a coup by its king against the Ottoman dictator Ion Dantescu, who then switched sides and joined the Soviets to avoid being steamrolled. Romania will be covered in a much later video in the future. Hungary started to negotiate with both the Soviets and Western allies about switching sides, as mentioned earlier. Hitler could not let this happen, as he ordered Operation Panzerfaust. Horthy resigned after German troops occupied the country and kidnapped his son. The Nazis then installed a puppet fascist state in Hungary, the Government of National Unity, which was led by the Eurocross Party until the Soviets took the country after the siege of Budapest. Horthy was later placed under house arrest in Bavaria before being arrested and imprisoned by the U.S. Army. Let's go over Griffin's commentary regarding Horthy's suppression of the Eurocross and their eventual opportunity to seize power. By the outbreak of war, scores of minute parties had sprung up hawking different blends of scythe cross and arrow cross fascism, but the only significant attempt at a fascist takeover of state power was mounted by Szalay. His Party of National Will was formed in 1935 and renamed the Arrow Cross Party Hungarist Movement in 1937. Backed by Nazi funds, it quickly grew strong enough to make Horthy fear a coup against his regency. Szalay was therefore arrested in 1938, but this did not prevent the party winning over 30% of the vote in the next elections. On his release in 1940, he built up party organization and propaganda so successfully that membership rose to 500,000. Frustrated in his attempts to achieve power under Horthy, who had ensured that the Nazification of Hungary was largely a cosmetic one, he started negotiations with the Germans. His moment finally came when the Germans, alerted to the region's plans to surrender to the Russians, occupied Hungary in October 1944. In 1950, Horthy would go on to spend his exile in Portugal, not returning to Hungary due to its Soviet-sponsored government being there at the time. He would give his own personal account of his life in his memoir, A Life for Hungary, noting how much he distrusted Hitler, hated communism, and how the many countries in the First World War had abused Hungary in his eyes, even giving praise to Salazar, who was ruling the country during his exile there, which makes a lot of sense given that they were both conservatives. We are deeply grateful for the hospitality that has been given us. It is with the utmost interest that I follow the rise of Portugal under the leadership of her wise Prime Minister, Dr. Oliveira Salazar. May his country have the happy future to which the diligence of its lovable people entitles it. Another aspect of Horthy's post-war reputation is in the case with the other dictators, as we will be going through, in that he was labeled a fascist. Again, similar to Dollfuss, this is a misidentification and ignorance of how conservatism can mutate and develop without subscribing to the fascist core as we've gone over. From looking back at what we just saw, it seems that Horthy was very much concerned with maintaining conservative convictions and institutions under the rising mounting pressures of the Third Reich. Although he had allowed many prime ministers to come into power who did fascistize the country, he still, in many ways, prevented them from letting the country become more and more authoritarian. Orban has an interesting reputation. Conservatives in Hungary, particularly Orban, love to sing his praise and see him as a national hero who defended his nation from Nazi aggression and arrow-cross tyranny, but also from the communists. Many like to downplay his anti-Semitism or even deny he was anti-Semitic at all. They cite his refusal to deport all the Jews. This, however, denies reality. We discussed his actions during the White Terror, but in addition, he passed a law requiring prison time for any Jewish man who has sex with a decent Hungarian woman, whatever that's supposed to mean. This false legacy is just a fantasy, and he, like the other Othkon dictators, were brutal oppressors. Being wants to apologize for the many mispronunciations. Being tried to correct as many as possible without breaking up the flow of the audio too much, but Austrian and Hungarian Being were unavailable for help. So again, sorry for butchering more human languages.
Valentine gifts, all of them are a but that's not all. This circular offers over 100 Valentine gifts and other products you use every day.
Oh, gosh. Looks like things will continue in part. It'll probably take months, years, or centuries for being a release. Golly gee whiz. They'll all be rotten closes by then.